September 19, 1943. The small market town of Bamber Bridge in Lancashire, England, hummed with the usual wartime activity as American soldiers from the 525th Quartermaster Truck Regiment mingled in local pubs and cafes alongside British civilians. The evening air carried the scent of fish and chips, the sound of laughter spilling from doorways, and something else entirely unexpected in rural England: the open, easy friendship between black American servicemen and white British townspeople. What the white American military police who arrived that evening expected to enforce would ignite one of the most extraordinary acts of civilian resistance in World War II history, transforming a quiet English town into the unlikely battleground for human dignity. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What began as a simple demand to segregate a local establishment would end with an entire British community choosing to exclude white American enforcers rather than the black soldiers who had become their friends, revealing a transatlantic clash of values that would challenge everything American military leadership believed about racial hierarchy. Private Eugene Booker of the 525th Quartermaster Truck Regiment had been stationed in Bamber Bridge for nearly 4 months when he walked into the Ye Old Hob Inn on that warm September evening. The 23-year-old driver from Atlanta, Georgia, had grown accustomed to something he had never experienced in his entire life: being treated as simply another human being. In the pubs and shops of this Lancashire town, no one moved away when he sat down. No one refused to serve him. Children waved at him on the streets. Elderly women invited him to Sunday dinner. Booker said to his friend, Private James Henderson, as they settled into their usual corner table at the Hob Inn, the weight of simple acceptance still felt almost surreal. In Alabama, in Georgia, in every corner of the American South he had known, his uniform would have meant nothing against the color of his skin. Here, 3,500 miles from home, British civilians saw the uniform first. The 525th was part of the massive American military buildup in Britain, preparing for the eventual invasion of occupied Europe. Unlike the majority of American combat units, the 525th was entirely composed of black enlisted men, led by white officers, a structure that reflected the strictly segregated nature of the United States Armed Forces. The regiment handled critical logistics work, driving supply trucks and managing quartermaster operations that would prove essential to the war effort. Their convoy routes crisscrossed southern England, delivering everything from ammunition to medical supplies, from spare tank parts to winter uniforms. Despite the vital nature of their work, they were subject to the same discriminatory policies that governed black servicemen throughout the American military. The unit had arrived in Bamber Bridge in early June of 1943, and the initial culture shock went both ways. For the soldiers, the absence of formal segregation was bewildering. For the British civilians of Bamber Bridge, the American military's racial policies were equally baffling. Britain had its own class divisions and prejudices, to be sure, but nothing quite like the American system of legal racial segregation. Most residents of Bamber Bridge had never encountered black people before the Americans arrived, and they approached these newcomers with curiosity rather than hostility. The town itself was unremarkable by English standards. Population approximately 7,000, Bamber Bridge had grown up around the textile industry that dominated much of Lancashire. The war had transformed some local facilities into munitions production, bringing new workers and new urgency to what had been a sleepy market town. The high street featured the typical assortment of shops: a butcher, a greengrocer, a chemist, several pubs, a post office, and the parish church of St. Saviour. It was into this ordinary English community that the 525th brought a piece of America that would challenge local assumptions and create unexpected alliances. Sergeant William Crossland, a white British soldier on leave visiting his family in Bamber Bridge, observed the growing friendship between the American soldiers and local civilians with interest. He later wrote in his diary that the black Americans were unfailingly polite, generous with their rations when families were struggling, and popular especially with the children who delighted in the chewing gum and chocolate the soldiers shared. In contrast, Crossland noted, some of the white American soldiers who occasionally passed through town carried themselves with an arrogance that rubbed locals the wrong way. particularly when they made disparaging comments about the British civilians fraternizing with their black countrymen. The relationship between the 525th and Bamber Bridge had deepened over the summer months. Private Booker had been invited to join the local cricket club, though he confessed he barely understood the rules. The gentle ribbing he received about his inability to bowl properly was done in the spirit of genuine camaraderie, the kind of teasing that indicated acceptance rather than exclusion. He spent Sunday afternoons at the cricket ground, learning the incomprehensible nuances of a sport that seemed designed to baffle Americans, sharing sandwiches and weak wartime tea with men who had become his friends. Private Henderson had struck up a genuine friendship with Thomas Radcliffe, the owner of the Hob Inn, who reserved a special table for the American soldiers each evening. Radcliffe, a 57-year-old veteran of the First World War, who had lost his left leg at Passchendaele, found the American soldiers' stories fascinating. In return, he shared his own experiences of the trenches, of the grinding horror of the Western Front, of the friends he had lost in the mud of Flanders. These were conversations between veterans of different wars, finding common ground in the universal experience of military service. Corporal Marcus Williams taught mathematics to Eleanor Hartley, the local schoolmaster's daughter, who was preparing for university examinations. Williams had been a teacher before the war, with a degree from Howard University in Washington. The school in Bamber Bridge had lost several teachers to military service, and Williams' offer to help with the advanced mathematics curriculum was gratefully accepted. He met with Eleanor twice weekly in the schoolmaster's parlor, working through calculus problems and geometric proofs, discussing academic possibilities that neither racism nor war could completely extinguish. These were not superficial connections, but real relationships built on mutual respect and shared humanity. The soldiers attended church services at St. Saviour, where Reverend Marcus Thompson welcomed them without hesitation or qualification. They joined in local fundraisers for war relief, contributing money from their modest pay to support British families affected by German attacks. They helped repair bomb damage after German aircraft occasionally dropped their loads while returning from raids on Liverpool or Manchester. They became, in every meaningful sense, part of the community. The situation created a profound problem for the American military command structure. The United States Army operated under strict segregation policies that reflected the Jim Crow laws of the American South. These policies were not merely customs, but rigidly enforced regulations backed by the threat of courts-martial and military prison. Black and white servicemen were housed in separate barracks, ate in separate mess halls, used separate recreational facilities, and were prohibited from socializing together in any context. Even blood plasma was segregated in military hospitals, despite the scientific absurdity of racial blood separation. When American forces deployed overseas, the military expected host countries to enforce these same segregationist practices. In many locations, American commanders successfully pressured local establishments to adopt color bars, refusing service to black servicemen to maintain the racial hierarchy American officers considered essential to military discipline. The logic, such as it was, held that allowing black soldiers to experience equality overseas would make them unwilling to accept subordinate status when they returned home. This was not an unreasonable fear from the perspective of those invested in maintaining racial oppression. It was, in fact, precisely what would happen. Britain, however, proved less compliant than American commanders anticipated. The British government, desperate for American military and economic support in the struggle against Germany, officially went along with some American demands for segregation. Certain areas were designated for white American troops only. Certain recreational facilities were tacitly understood to be off-limits to black servicemen. However, individual British civilians often refused to cooperate with these arrangements. Stories circulated throughout England of pub owners who defied American military requests to bar black soldiers, of British women who dated black American servicemen despite threats and intimidation from white American military police, of entire communities that rejected the notion that skin color should determine where a soldier in uniform could drink a pint of bitter. These acts of resistance were not coordinated or organized. They emerged from individual moral choices, from British civilians deciding that American racial policies violated their sense of fair play and basic decency. The British government issued half-hearted guidance, suggesting that civilians should respect American military policies, but enforcement was essentially non-existent. Local authorities had no interest in alienating their own populations to enforce foreign segregation practices, especially when those practices seemed fundamentally unjust to most British people. The result was a patchwork of compliance and resistance, with individual communities and establishments making their own decisions about whether to honor American segregationist demands. Major General Charles Bonesteel, commanding American forces in the region, viewed the situation in Bamber Bridge with growing concern. Reports had reached his headquarters that black soldiers were socializing freely with white British civilians, that romantic relationships were developing between black servicemen and white British women, and that local establishments refused to enforce any kind of racial separation. To officers raised in the American South, this represented not just a breach of military discipline, but a fundamental threat to the social order they believed necessary to maintain control over black troops. Bonesteel's concerns were shared by many white American officers who saw the British tolerance of integration as dangerous and destabilizing. They worried that black soldiers who experienced equality in Britain would return to the United States, demanding similar treatment, would refuse to accept relegation to second-class citizenship, would organize resistance to Jim Crow laws and racial oppression. These fears were entirely justified. The experience of black servicemen in more egalitarian societies would indeed fuel the post-war civil rights movement. On September 20th, 1943, a decision was made at the command level to address the Bamber Bridge situation directly. A contingent of white American military police would be dispatched to enforce proper segregation protocols in the town's public establishments. The MPs would make clear to local business owners that serving black and white servicemen together was unacceptable, and that the cooperation of British civilians was expected and required. The military police were given authority to place establishments off limits to all American personnel if they refused to comply with segregation demands. What the command staff failed to appreciate was that the people of Bamber Bridge had already made their choice, and that choice had nothing to do with military regulations or official policy. They had gotten to know the soldiers of the 525th as individuals, had formed friendships based on shared experiences and mutual respect, and had concluded that American racial policies were morally indefensible. The attempt to enforce segregation would not be met with compliance, but with resistance. The military police contingent that rolled into Bamber Bridge that evening consisted of 6 men in 2 jeeps, led by Sergeant Roy Wyndham from Biloxi, Mississippi. Wyndham carried explicit orders to visit the town's primary drinking establishments and ensure they understood proper racial protocols. His briefing had emphasized the importance of maintaining military discipline and the threat posed by allowing black soldiers to socialize with white civilians. In Wyndham's worldview, racial separation was not merely policy, but natural law, the foundation of civilized society. Wyndham's first stop was the Ye Old Hob Inn, where intelligence reports indicated that black soldiers regularly socialized with British civilians. The pub dated back to the 17th century, a timber-framed building with low ceilings and uneven floors that had witnessed 3 centuries of English history. On this particular evening, it would witness something unprecedented: the collision between American racial oppression and British working-class solidarity. Wyndham entered the pub at approximately 8:15 in the evening, his military police armband clearly visible, his posture radiating official authority. The main room was crowded with the usual evening clientele: off-duty British Home Guard members still in uniform, factory workers from the local munitions plant with their hands still stained from powder, several soldiers from the 525th enjoying their evening pints, and a handful of British civilians engaged in the serious business of drinking rationed beer. The conversation was animated, the atmosphere warm and convivial, the kind of easy sociability that develops in community gathering places. The arrival of the American military police brought an immediate chill to the room. Conversations faltered and stopped. Soldiers from the 525th tensed, recognizing from bitter experience what the presence of MPs typically meant. British civilians looked up with curiosity tinged with concern. Sensing that something unpleasant was about to unfold, Wyndham approached the bar where proprietor Thomas Radcliffe was pulling pints, and in a voice loud enough to carry across the suddenly quiet room, delivered his message. The Hob Inn would no longer serve colored soldiers. This was a direct order from American military command. Any establishment that continued to serve colored troops would be placed off limits to all American personnel, effectively destroying a significant portion of their wartime business. Radcliffe was expected to comply immediately and to inform other pub owners in town of the new policy. Radcliffe set down the glass he was holding with deliberate care. He looked at Sergeant Wyndham for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then at the black soldiers who had become regular fixtures in his pub, then back at the military policeman. The silence in the room was absolute, every patron waiting to see how the publican would respond to this ultimatum. Radcliffe said, his Lancashire accent thick with barely controlled anger, that if he had to choose who was no longer welcome in his establishment, it would not be the lads who had shown nothing but courtesy and respect since arriving in Bamber Bridge. The soldiers of the 525th were paying customers who caused no trouble, who treated his staff with politeness, who had become friends to many in the community. If the Hob Inn was to be placed off limits to American personnel, then so be it. But that ban would apply to military police and anyone else who supported segregation, not to the soldiers whose only crime was the color of their skin. The confrontation might have ended there, but Wyndham made a critical error. He threatened Radcliffe directly, suggesting that continued resistance would result in formal military action against his business, that American authorities could make life very difficult for a publican who refused to cooperate with official policies. There were ways to shut down civilian establishments, Wyndham implied, ways that had nothing to do with military regulations, but with mysterious shortages of beer, with health inspections that found violations, with local authorities pressured by American military command. Radcliffe responded by physically removing Wyndham from the premises. Despite his prosthetic leg and advancing years, the former soldier grabbed the military policeman by the collar and propelled him toward the door, using his cane to hasten Wyndham's exit. The other military police moved to intervene, but found their path blocked by British civilians and American soldiers who had risen from their tables with clear intent. Wyndham stumbled out onto the street, his dignity severely damaged, his authority thoroughly undermined. The other patrons, British and American alike, erupted in applause. Soldiers from the 525th stood and saluted Radcliffe, a gesture of respect and gratitude. British civilians bought rounds of drinks for the Americans, toasting defiance of unjust orders. The atmosphere shifted from tense confrontation to celebratory defiance, a collective recognition that something important had just occurred. Word of the incident spread through Bamber Bridge with remarkable speed. By the time Wyndham and his contingent regrouped and visited the next establishment, the White Bull Pub, they found a handwritten sign in the window. "We serve soldiers regardless of color. Military police not welcome." The landlord, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, made clear that Wyndham and his men would receive no service and no cooperation. The same scene repeated at the Rose and Crown, at the Lamb Inn, at every public house in the town centre. The publicans of Bamber Bridge, most of whom had never met before this evening, had collectively decided that they would rather lose all American military business than enforce segregation. Some displayed signs, others simply informed the military police verbally. But the message was consistent. American racial policies would not be implemented in their establishments. At the Old Oak Pub, the landlady went further, informing Wyndham that if the military police returned to harass her customers or her business, she would personally ensure that every newspaper in Lancashire heard about American attempts to force racial segregation on British civilians. She had contacts with the Manchester Guardian, she said, and they would be very interested in a story about American military authorities threatening British business owners who refused to discriminate. The military police contingent withdrew to consider their options. Their mission had been a complete failure. Not a single establishment had agreed to enforce segregation. Worse, they had been publicly humiliated, physically ejected from one pub, and verbally eviscerated at others. The soldiers of the 525th, rather than being cowed or controlled, were being celebrated as victims of unjust persecution. British civilians, rather than deferring to American military authority, had united in resistance. Lieutenant Colonel William Barrett, commanding officer of the 525th, received word of the developing situation with a mixture of concern and quiet satisfaction. Barrett was a white officer from Philadelphia, a career military man who had commanded black troops for nearly 2 years. Unlike many of his fellow officers, Barrett had developed genuine respect for the men under his leadership. He understood the absurdity and injustice of the segregation policies he was required to enforce, and he had watched with approval as his soldiers found acceptance in Bamber Bridge that they would never experience in most of America. Barrett said to his executive officer, Captain Robert Morrison, that the situation required careful handling. The military police had overstepped badly, created a confrontation that could have been avoided, and alienated the local civilian population. But if this escalated into a formal confrontation between black soldiers and white MPs, if violence erupted, the consequences for his regiment would be severe. Barrett knew that any incident involving racial conflict would be used by segregationist officers to argue for even stricter controls on black troops, for more punitive policies, for courts-martial that would destroy military careers and send soldiers to stockades. Morrison, also from Philadelphia and equally uncomfortable with military segregation policies, agreed that the situation was delicate. He suggested that Barrett should make contact with the local British authorities, with the town council and police, to ensure that civilian officials understood what was happening and why. If British civilians and American black soldiers united against military police enforcement, it would create a diplomatic situation that higher command would struggle to resolve without backing down. The tension in Bamber Bridge continued to rise over the following days. More military police arrived from regional headquarters, ostensibly to maintain order, but in reality to intimidate the local civilians and the soldiers of the 525th. Their presence on the streets was provocative, patrols walking through town in groups, glaring at black soldiers and British civilians alike, making clear through body language and occasional verbal confrontations that they considered the situation unacceptable. British civilians responded with increasing defiance. Women who had befriended American soldiers made a point of being seen in public with their black friends, walking arm in arm down the high street, sitting together in cafes, openly challenging the segregationist assumptions behind the military police presence. Shop owners posted signs indicating they served all soldiers equally, some going further to explicitly state that supporters of segregation were unwelcome. The atmosphere in town became charged with a sense of impending confrontation. The local newspaper, the Bamber Bridge Chronicle, ran an editorial praising the 525th for their service and condemning attempts to introduce American racial policies into Lancashire. The editorial writer, a veteran of the Boer War named Harold Ashton, compared American segregation to German racial laws, drawing an uncomfortable parallel that made explicit what many had been thinking. If Britain was fighting against tyranny and racial oppression in Europe, Ashton wrote, it would be the height of hypocrisy to allow those same policies to be implemented on British soil. Private Booker wrote a letter to his mother in Atlanta, describing the situation with wonder and confusion. He told her that for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to be treated as a full human being, to walk into a shop and not see suspicion or contempt in the shopkeeper's eyes, to speak to a white woman without fear that some perceived slight would lead to violence or accusation. The fact that this revelation came 3,500 miles from home, in a country he had never heard of before the war, struck him as both miraculous and profoundly sad. His mother's response when it arrived weeks later was bittersweet. She was glad that he had found kindness and acceptance, but she warned him not to forget the reality waiting for him when he returned home. The South had not changed, she wrote, and men who forgot their place faced consequences that could be fatal. She reminded him of cousins and neighbors who had been targeted for perceived arrogance, for acting too white, for failing to demonstrate sufficient deference. Her words carried the weight of generations of survival under oppression, the accumulated wisdom of how to navigate a society designed to devalue and destroy black life. On September 24th, the situation exploded into open conflict. The incident began at approximately 9:30 in the evening when a military police patrol attempted to arrest Private Eugene Nunn of the 525th for being improperly dressed in uniform while in the town centre. Nunn, who was walking with his girlfriend Margaret Foster, a 19-year-old British woman who worked at the local bakery, protested that his uniform was identical to those of dozens of other soldiers visible on the street. The MPs insisted on the arrest. In reality, Nunn's uniform was perfectly regulation. The true offence was his relationship with a white woman, a relationship that violated every assumption the military police held about proper racial boundaries. When Nunn resisted, pointing out the obvious pretense behind the arrest, the MPs attempted to physically restrain him. Margaret Foster, rather than stepping back as the military police expected, intervened, demanding to know by what authority they were harassing her boyfriend. British civilians intervened immediately. A crowd gathered around the military police jeep within minutes, demanding that Nunn be released, that the harassment stop, that the military police leave Bamber Bridge and not return. The crowd was predominantly working-class men and women, people who worked in factories and shops, who had little power in normal circumstances, but who recognized injustice when they saw it and refused to accept it. More soldiers from the 525th, both on duty and off duty, converged on the scene. Word had spread through the regiment's barracks that military police were harassing one of their own, and soldiers responded with the kind of solidarity that military units develop. They arrived in groups of 5 and 10, surrounding the military police jeep, demanding the release of Private Nunn, making clear through their presence that any attempt to remove him would require going through all of them. The military police called for backup, and within minutes, additional jeeps arrived with reinforcements. The situation deteriorated rapidly. What had started as an attempted arrest of one soldier had become a confrontation between approximately 200 soldiers from the 525th and 30 military police. British civilians, far from fleeing the potential violence, stood alongside the black soldiers, some of them armed with improvised weapons, cricket bats and tools from nearby shops. The military police found themselves badly outnumbered and surrounded by an angry crowd that showed no signs of dispersing. They retreated to the local MP station, a small building near the town centre that had been requisitioned for military police use. The crowd followed them, surrounding the building, demanding justice, demanding respect, demanding an end to harassment and discrimination. The situation teetered on the edge of serious violence. Lieutenant Colonel Barrett arrived to find chaos barely contained. The base commander was screaming at him to get his soldiers under control, threatening courts-martial for everyone involved, promising that this incident would result in severe punishment for the entire regiment. Other American officers were present, some urging immediate use of force to disperse the crowd, others recognizing that violence would only make the situation worse. Barrett understood that he was looking at the accumulated frustration of men who had endured systematic discrimination their entire lives, who had been promised that military service would earn them respect and equality, who had found both in Bamber Bridge, only to have it threatened by the same racist policies they had hoped to leave behind. These were not men rioting without cause, but men defending their dignity against yet another attempt to strip it away. Barrett stepped between the two groups, holding up his hands for quiet. The crowd was loud, angry, chanting demands and accusations. Barrett's voice, when he spoke, was barely audible over the noise. He repeated himself louder, asking for the chance to speak, promising that he would address their grievances if they would give him the opportunity. Slowly, the crowd quieted. Barrett said that no one would be arrested tonight, that he would personally guarantee it, that Private Nunn would return to barracks without charges. He acknowledged that the military police had overstepped, that the arrest attempt had been pretextual and unjust, that he understood why his soldiers were angry, but he urged everyone to return to base or to their homes before this situation turned deadly, before shots were fired that could not be taken back. The crowd was not immediately convinced. Voices shouted from the mass of soldiers, demanding justice, demanding that the military police be removed from Bamber Bridge, demanding guarantees that the harassment would stop. British civilians added their voices, insisting that American racial policies had no place in their town, that they would continue to associate with whomever they chose regardless of military regulations. Then something extraordinary happened. Thomas Radcliffe, the publican who had first defied the segregation order, pushed his way to the front of the crowd. He climbed onto the hood of a jeep, using his cane for balance, and addressed the assembled soldiers and civilians. His voice carried the authority of age and experience, of a man who had survived one world war and understood the cost of violence. Radcliffe said that he understood their anger, that every man and woman in Bamber Bridge stood with them against injustice, that the attempt to enforce segregation in their town had been met with unanimous resistance. But violence tonight would give their enemies exactly what they wanted, would provide justification for crackdowns and punishments, would be used as evidence that integration led to disorder. The soldiers of the 525th had won something precious in this town, had proven that decency and respect could transcend the artificial divisions of race. He urged them not to throw that away in a moment of understandable rage. Other British civilians spoke up, echoing Radcliffe's message. The schoolmaster, Peter Hartley, whose daughter was being tutored by Corporal Williams, climbed up beside Radcliffe. He reminded the crowd that they were making history, that this moment would be remembered, but that the memory should be of solidarity and moral courage, not of violence and chaos. The way they responded tonight would determine whether Bamber Bridge stood as an example of successful resistance to oppression or as just another incident of racial conflict. The crowd slowly began to disperse. Soldiers from the 525th, reassured by Lieutenant Colonel Barrett's guarantees and persuaded by the pleas of their British friends, started returning to base under their officers' escort. British civilians drifted back to their homes, though many remained on the streets long into the night, watching to ensure that the military police did not renew their harassment. The military police remained barricaded in their station until well after midnight. When they finally emerged, they found the streets empty and silent, but also found messages chalked on walls and painted on signs making clear that they were unwelcome in Bamber Bridge. The messages were blunt. MPs not wanted. Segregation not welcome here. We stand with the 525th. The town had made its position unmistakably clear. The aftermath of the Bamber Bridge confrontation sent shockwaves through the American military command structure in Britain. Major General Bonesteel demanded courts-martial for the soldiers involved in what he characterized as a near riot and insubordination. He wanted examples made, wanted punishments severe enough to deter any future challenges to military authority and racial policies. In his view, the confrontation represented exactly the kind of breakdown in discipline that justified strict segregation. Lieutenant Colonel Barrett threatened to resign his commission if any charges were brought against his men. He submitted a detailed report documenting the military police harassment that had provoked the incident, the pretextual arrest attempt, the escalation caused by MP aggression. He argued that his soldiers had shown remarkable restraint under severe provocation, that they had dispersed peacefully when asked, that charging them with crimes would be a profound injustice. Barrett's report was supported by statements from British civilian authorities who confirmed that American black soldiers had not initiated the confrontation. The British civilian population of Bamber Bridge sent a formal petition to American military headquarters, signed by over 800 residents out of a town of 7,000. The petition demanded that the military police who had attempted to enforce segregation be barred from the town permanently, that American authorities respect British civilian autonomy in determining who was welcome in local establishments, that the soldiers of the 525th receive apologies for harassment and discrimination. The petition was covered by multiple newspapers, turning a local incident into a national story. Local newspapers picked up the story enthusiastically. The headline in the Manchester Guardian read, "Lancashire Town Rejects American Race Rules." The article detailed the confrontation, interviewed British civilians who praised the American black soldiers and condemned segregationist policies, and raised uncomfortable questions about British government complicity with American racial discrimination. The story was reprinted in newspapers across Britain, creating public pressure on both British and American authorities. The Daily Mirror ran an editorial comparing American segregation policies unfavorably to German racial laws, pointing out the hypocrisy of fighting against tyranny while enforcing discrimination. The editorial argued that British civilians had a moral obligation to resist unjust policies, even when those policies were backed by powerful allies. The comparison to German policies was deliberately provocative, forcing readers to confront the uncomfortable similarities between American Jim Crow laws and the racial theories the Allies were fighting against. In Parliament, several MPs raised questions about British government cooperation with American segregation policies. Labour MP Tom Dryburgh demanded to know why British authorities were allowing American military police to harass British civilians and American soldiers on British soil. He called for a formal statement of policy clarifying that British citizens were free to associate with whomever they chose, regardless of American military preferences. The diplomatic pressure, combined with the public relations disaster, forced American military command to reconsider their position. In a remarkable reversal, segregationist policies that had sparked the confrontation were quietly abandoned, at least in Bamber Bridge. The military police contingent that had initiated the crisis was reassigned to other duties far from Lancashire. No courts-martial were convened against soldiers of the 525th. An unofficial understanding emerged. Bamber Bridge would remain a zone of relative racial equality, a small pocket of integrated society within the larger framework of a segregated military. The decision was pragmatic rather than principled. American commanders recognized that enforcing segregation in Bamber Bridge would require ongoing confrontation with both British civilians and American black soldiers, would generate continued negative publicity, and would damage relations with British authorities at a time when cooperation was essential for the war effort. It was easier to allow one small town to be an exception than to fight a battle that could not be won without making martyrs of people who had committed no crime beyond demanding basic human dignity. Private Booker returned to the Ye Olde Hob Inn a week after the confrontation, uncertain of his welcome after the violence that had nearly erupted. He worried that British civilians might have been frightened by the confrontation, might decide that friendship with American black soldiers brought too much trouble. He approached the pub with apprehension, half expecting to find it closed or to be turned away. Instead, he found his usual table waiting, with a pint of bitter already poured. Thomas Radcliffe refused payment, saying that any man who stood up for his dignity deserved a drink on the house. The other patrons, British and American, greeted him as they always had, with casual friendship that made no reference to recent events. If anything, the bonds between the soldiers and the town had strengthened through the confrontation, tested and proven genuine. The soldiers of the 525th would remain in Bamber Bridge until March of 1944, when they were transferred to southern England in preparation for the Normandy invasion. During those remaining months, the relationship between the regiment and the town deepened further. Soldiers attended local weddings, stood as godfathers to British children, became integrated into the community in ways that would have been unimaginable in the segregated American South. Christmas of 1943 was celebrated jointly, with soldiers invited into British homes to share rationed turkey and precious pudding. They brought American supplies, chocolate and canned goods that made wartime Christmas more festive, while British families shared their traditions and welcomed the Americans as honored guests. For many soldiers, it was the first Christmas they had experienced as equals, as valued members of a community rather than tolerated outsiders. Corporal Marcus Williams proposed to Eleanor Hartley in January of 1944, presenting her with a simple ring purchased from his modest military pay. The proposal took place in the parlor, where they had spent months working through mathematical problems, where friendship had deepened into love, where two people had found connection across the boundaries of race and nation. Eleanor accepted without hesitation, knowing that their marriage would face challenges, but believing that love justified the risk. The wedding was celebrated in the local Anglican church in early February, with the entire regiment in attendance and half the town cramming into the pews. Reverend Thompson performed the ceremony with obvious pleasure, speaking of love transcending artificial divisions, of unity in diversity, of hope for a better future. The reception was held in the church hall, with British and American guests mingling freely, dancing to music provided by the regimental band, celebrating a union that represented everything the confrontation had been about. It was one of thousands of such marriages between black American servicemen and white British women during the war years, relationships that challenged racial orthodoxies and created transatlantic families. These marriages were controversial in both countries, condemned by American segregationists and viewed with concern by British authorities worried about social disruption. But for the couples involved, they were affirmations of human connection, choices made in defiance of prejudice and in favor of love. When the 525th departed for the invasion preparations in March, the residents of Bamber Bridge lined the streets to bid them farewell. Children waved American and British flags side by side. Women wept openly, saying goodbye to friends and, in some cases, to husbands and fiancés. Men who had served in the First World War saluted smartly as the convoy of trucks rolled past, honoring fellow soldiers heading toward danger. Private Booker, looking back at the town that had given him his first taste of genuine equality, felt tears streaming down his face. He had arrived in Bamber Bridge expecting nothing more than a temporary posting, a few months in a foreign country before returning to the familiar oppression of home. Instead, he had discovered that human dignity was not an impossible dream, but a practical reality. That respect and equality required only the willingness to treat people as individuals rather than as representatives of racial categories. The 525th Quartermaster Truck Regiment would serve with distinction through the Normandy invasion and the subsequent push across France and into Germany. Their trucks carried the ammunition, fuel, food, and medical supplies that kept Allied armies moving forward through some of the most intense operations of the war. They drove through hostile conditions, navigated bombed-out roads where a wrong turn could mean driving into enemy positions, worked impossible hours under brutal conditions that tested human endurance. They were present at the liberation of France, driving supplies to combat units that depended on their logistics support. They crossed the Rhine in the spring of 1945, carrying materials needed for the final push into Germany. They saw the concentration camps, witnessed the evidence of industrial-scale genocide, confronted the horrific reality of what the war had been fought to stop. The irony was not lost on them. They were helping to liberate victims of racial oppression while themselves subject to racial discrimination. 37 members of the regiment would not survive the war. They died in vehicle accidents on dangerous roads, in artillery attacks on supply columns, from disease and exhaustion, in the brutal conditions of the European theater. Their sacrifices were made in defense of freedoms they were denied in their own country, fighting for a nation that treated them as second-class citizens, serving with honor despite systematic dishonor. Their names are recorded on memorials, but their stories are largely forgotten in the broader narrative of the war. After the war ended, the soldiers of the 525th returned to an America that had not changed in their absence. They came home to segregated buses, to water fountains marked colored only, to restaurants that refused them service, to hotels that would not give them rooms. They came home to the constant threat of violence for any perceived challenge to racial hierarchy, to a society that valued their sacrifice in theory while denying them basic rights in practice. They had helped save the world from fascism, only to return to American apartheid. Private Eugene Booker returned to Atlanta in the summer of 1945. He found work as a porter at a downtown hotel where he was required to use the service entrance and eat his lunch in the basement. He was prohibited from trying on clothes in department stores, from sitting in the main sections of movie theaters, from registering to vote without passing literacy tests specifically designed to exclude black citizens. The uniform that had earned him respect in England meant nothing on the streets of his hometown, carefully packed away in a closet as a reminder of a different world. But something had fundamentally changed in Booker and in thousands of black veterans like him. They had seen a different world, had experienced treatment as equals, had proven their courage and capability beyond any reasonable dispute. The hypocrisy of fighting against tyranny abroad while accepting oppression at home became intolerable. These veterans had the organizational skills, discipline, and unwillingness to accept injustice that their military service had instilled. They would not quietly return to the subordinate status that American society expected of them. Booker became involved in the local NAACP chapter in voter registration drives that challenged discriminatory practices, in the boycotts and sit-ins that would eventually dismantle legal segregation. He drew on his military experience to organize protests, to maintain discipline under pressure, to persist in the face of intimidation. When asked what had inspired his activism, he would always tell the story of Bamber Bridge, of the English town that had chosen solidarity over prejudice, that had demonstrated racial equality was not impossible, but simply required the will to enforce it. The story he told was one of hope grounded in experience. He had lived in a community where skin color did not determine worth, where friendships crossed racial lines without incident, where human dignity was the default rather than the exception. That experience proved that segregation was a choice, not an inevitability, that racial hierarchy was maintained through enforcement rather than nature. If British civilians in a small Lancashire town could reject racial discrimination, Americans could do the same. Thomas Radcliffe continued operating the year-old Hob Inn until his death in 1958. He never removed the small American flag that soldiers of the 525th had given him, keeping it mounted behind the bar as a memorial to the friendship between his town and the regiment. He corresponded with several veterans over the years, maintaining connections formed during the war, sharing news of Bamber Bridge, and receiving updates about life in America. When Booker wrote to inform Radcliffe of his civil rights activism, the old publican responded with enthusiastic support. He sent newspaper clippings about the growing civil rights movement in Britain, about the beginning of Caribbean immigration, and the challenges of creating a multiracial society. He shared his conviction that the stand Bamber Bridge had taken during the war represented values worth fighting for in peacetime, that human dignity required constant defense against those who would deny it. Radcliffe's funeral in 1958 was attended by 3 former members of the 525th who made the journey from America to pay their respects. Eugene Booker, Marcus Williams, and James Henderson stood in the church where they had been welcomed decades earlier, honoring a man who had defended their dignity when doing so required courage. They carried his casket to the gravesite, served as pallbearers for a friend who had stood with them when it mattered most. Bamber Bridge itself became a symbol of resistance to racial injustice, a demonstration that ordinary people could reject discriminatory policies through simple acts of solidarity. The town's story was largely forgotten in the immediate post-war years, overshadowed by larger historical narratives about the war and its aftermath. The confrontation did not appear in official histories, was not taught in schools, became a local memory rather than national consciousness. But the story survived through veterans' accounts, through local oral history, through the memories of those who had participated in or witnessed the events. Gradually, historians rediscovered what had happened in Bamber Bridge, recognizing its significance as an example of successful resistance to institutionalized racism. The story found new audiences in the 1980s and 90s as scholars began examining the experiences of Black American soldiers during World War II. In 2009, the town erected a memorial honoring the 525th Quartermaster Truck Regiment and commemorating the events of September 1943. The memorial consists of a bronze statue depicting a Black American soldier and a British civilian shaking hands, symbolizing the alliance that had defied military segregation. Surrounding plaques tell the story of the confrontation and its resolution, ensuring that future generations understand what happened and why it mattered. The dedication ceremony was attended by descendants of the original soldiers, British veterans who remembered the events, and civic leaders who recognized the contemporary relevance of the historical moment being commemorated. Speakers drew connections between the Bamber Bridge confrontation and ongoing struggles for racial justice, noting that the example of solidarity across racial lines remained relevant decades later. In an era still grappling with questions of equality and discrimination, the story offered hope grounded in historical reality. Lieutenant Colonel William Barrett continued his military career after the war, eventually reaching the rank of full colonel before retiring in 1954. He wrote extensively about his experiences commanding black troops, arguing forcefully for military integration in articles and testimony before congressional committees. His writings challenged the racist assumptions that had justified segregation, documenting the courage and capability of the soldiers under his command. Barrett's testimony was cited by President Harry Truman when justifying Executive Order 9981 in 1948, which officially desegregated the United States military. The order was controversial, opposed by many senior officers who insisted that integration would destroy military effectiveness. Barrett's experience proved otherwise, demonstrating that black and white soldiers could serve together effectively when given the opportunity and when commanders rejected discriminatory policies. He never forgot the soldiers of the 525th, maintaining connections with veterans throughout his retirement. He spent his later years advocating for veterans' rights and civil rights more broadly, using his status as a former military officer to lend credibility to causes that challenged the racial status quo. He attended civil rights marches in the 1950s and 60s, an elderly white veteran standing alongside black activists demanding justice. The military police who attempted to enforce segregation in Bamber Bridge largely disappeared into historical obscurity. Sergeant Roy Wyndham returned to Mississippi after the war, resuming his civilian life in a society still rigidly segregated by law and custom. He died in 1963, the same year that civil rights activist Medgar Evers was assassinated and 4 young girls were killed in the Birmingham church bombing. The world Wyndham had tried to preserve through force was crumbling, undone by the courage of people like the soldiers he had attempted to intimidate. For the British residents of Bamber Bridge, the events of September 1943 became a source of lasting pride. In a war where Britain often felt like a junior partner to American power, dependent on American resources and military might for survival, the town's defiance of American racial policies represented an assertion of moral independence. British civilians had sided with justice over expedience, with human dignity over political convenience. That choice, made in a small Lancashire town under wartime conditions, resonated far beyond its immediate context. It demonstrated that resistance to injustice was possible even when facing powerful institutions, that ordinary people could make moral choices that challenged official policies. The story became part of local identity, a reminder that Bamber Bridge had stood for something important during a moment of historical crisis. The story of Bamber Bridge challenges simplistic narratives about World War II. It reminds us that the conflict was not simply democracy versus tyranny, but a complex struggle in which the democratic nations themselves harbored profound injustices. Black American soldiers fought against oppression abroad while enduring racist discrimination at home, a contradiction so glaring that it demanded acknowledgement. The British civilians who stood with these soldiers recognized this contradiction and refused to be complicit in its perpetuation. Corporal Marcus Williams and his British wife Eleanor raised 4 children in Liverpool, where Williams worked as a mathematics teacher after completing his degree under the educational benefits provided to veterans. He never forgot the fear he had felt during the confrontation with military police, the sense that violence could erupt at any moment, that his life could be destroyed for demanding basic respect. But he also never forgot the support of the British civilians who stood beside him, who chose principle over safety. Williams returned to Bamber Bridge for the first time in 1967, bringing his teenage children to see the town where he had experienced his first taste of equality. They walked the streets together, visited the Ye Old Hob Inn now under new management, met with residents who remembered the events of 24 years earlier. His daughter, listening to the stories, asked her father why America had treated him so badly when he had been willing to die for his country. Williams had no good answer to that question, only the observation that sometimes the most profound truths were the most difficult to articulate. He told her that human beings were capable of both terrible cruelty and extraordinary kindness, that the same country that had maintained brutal segregation had also produced people willing to fight against it. The struggle for justice was ongoing, he said, requiring constant effort but ultimately achievable, because the example of places like Bamber Bridge proved that equality was possible. The 525th Quartermaster Truck Regiment was officially deactivated in 1946. Its members dispersed to civilian life, carrying memories of brotherhood forged under difficult conditions and friendships that transcended racial divisions. Many veterans maintained contact with each other, forming associations that persisted for decades. Their annual reunions were attended not only by American veterans, but also by British civilians from Bamber Bridge, creating a community of remembrance that honored what they had accomplished together. At these reunions, aging veterans shared stories of their wartime service, of the logistics operations that had supported the Allied victory, of the discrimination they had faced, and the solidarity they had found. They remembered comrades who had not survived, whose names were read aloud at memorial services. They celebrated the friendships that had endured across decades and oceans, relationships formed during the war and maintained through correspondence and occasional visits. In the broader sweep of history, the confrontation at Bamber Bridge was a minor incident, a footnote to the massive global conflict of World War II. No major operations were affected, no strategic objectives secured, no turning points reached. Yet in its own way, the story contains as much truth about courage, solidarity, and justice as any account of military valor. The British civilians who refused to enforce segregation demonstrated bravery that required no weapons, only the willingness to do what was right, despite pressure to do otherwise. For the soldiers of the 525th, Bamber Bridge represented a revelation about what their lives could be, about the dignity and respect that had been stolen from them by American racial policies. That revelation was painful in its implications, making the return to segregation after the war almost unbearable. But it was also empowering. They had seen proof that racial equality was achievable, that it did not lead to chaos or disorder, but to simple human decency. That proof sustained them through the difficult years of the civil rights struggle that would eventually dismantle legal segregation. When facing dogs and fire hoses in Birmingham, when enduring arrests and beatings during freedom rides, when organizing voter registration drives in Mississippi, these veterans drew on the memory of Bamber Bridge. They had experienced equality, had lived in a community where skin color did not determine worth, and they were determined to create that reality in their own country. The legacy of Bamber Bridge extends beyond the specific individuals and events of September 1943. It stands as a reminder that ordinary people, faced with moral choices, have the power to reject injustice even when that injustice is backed by powerful institutions. The pub owners who defied segregation orders, the civilians who stood with black soldiers against military police, the town that collectively chose solidarity over submission, all demonstrated that resistance to oppression does not require extraordinary heroism. It requires only a fundamental commitment to human equality, a willingness to stand up for what is right, even when doing so involves personal risk. The people of Bamber Bridge made that choice, and in doing so, they created a moment of historical significance that resonates decades later. Their example proves that change is possible when individuals choose justice over convenience, when communities unite against discrimination, when ordinary people refuse to accept injustice as normal or inevitable. When veterans of the 525th spoke about their experiences in later years, they invariably returned to their time in Bamber Bridge as the moment when they understood that the struggle for racial justice was winnable. They had seen a community choose integration over segregation, acceptance over prejudice, solidarity over division. That vision sustained them through the long fight for civil rights, providing concrete evidence that human beings were capable of transcending racial hatred when they chose to do so. The soldiers and civilians of Bamber Bridge did not set out to make history or to strike a blow against racial injustice. They simply refused to participate in a system they recognized as fundamentally wrong. That refusal, multiplied across thousands of small decisions and individual acts of courage, would eventually contribute to the transformation of racial relations in America and beyond. The arc of history bent toward justice, but it bent because people like those in Bamber Bridge pushed it in that direction. Today, visitors to Bamber Bridge can walk the same streets that soldiers of the 525th walked 80 years ago. The Ye Old Hob Inn still stands, though under different ownership and with modern modifications. The memorial to the regiment serves as a gathering place for community events and educational programs about racial justice and equality. School groups visit to learn about the confrontation, about the choice the town made, about the ongoing relevance of that historical moment. The story that began with an attempt to enforce segregation has become a story about the power of solidarity, the courage of ordinary people, and the possibility of building a more just world through collective action. It reminds new generations that injustice persists only when people accept it, that change happens when individuals and communities decide that acceptance is no longer possible. The example of Bamber Bridge proves that resistance works, that solidarity matters, that justice is achievable. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.